a lot of time at the end to answer any questions. And so I do see some familiar names of the few people that are in here. And so I hope this isn't too much of maybe what you've heard from some of my other presentations, but we actually have some updates from Texas Parks and Wildlife that just came out effective January 27th of this year. And so I think this is actually the first program that I'm going to be covering them. So I know for sure that will be something new and different. So aquatic vegetation, it can be a really broad category in terms of management. Of course, every situation is different. And so during, these lunchtime webinars, I try to get some of the basic or the number one facts that you need for starting an aquatic vegetation management plan. And so just kind of a little background on why you would want to be trying to control some of your aquatic vegetation, which a lot of pond owners are very familiar with, but I do get people from time to time wondering why we should be killing aquatic vegetation, why we should be killing this growth, especially if it's native aquatic vegetation. And so, of course, there's kind of a thin balance that you need to have. I typically recommend about only 10 to 15% of your pond having some type of aquatic vegetation. And if it's over that 15%, it's going to really start becoming somewhat of an issue. And so in terms of why controlling, one of the number one reasons that a lot of people who have certain types of species in their pond is to actually reduce water loss. And so some people might not know this, but a lot of our aquatic vegetation increases water loss through their transpiration of the plant. And so just an example of an invasive species, our water hyacinth, that can actually increase water loss 200 to 300%. And so if you have a pond that is roughly 5 feet, 6 feet, at the end of a dry season, you may not have a pond at all if it's filled with one of these species. And so this isn't just the case with our water hyacinth. This is also the case with some of our native species like cattails as well. Cattails can actually increase water loss up to 75 to 80%. And so this is important to keep in mind, just to kind of keep there in the back of your mind. If you have a situation like you see on the left-hand side, you're really going to see a significant amount of water loss in your water body. And of course, in Texas, we like to hold on to our water the best that we can. And so this, again, is kind of one of the top reasons that's up here. And then, of course, you can reduce breeding habitat for noxious insects. A lot of your mosquitoes and your midges like to breed in these heavily dense areas of vegetation, and these dense stands of your rushes and sedges, your cattails, and of course these mosquitoes and midges can bring other problems into maybe your overall land operation by carrying certain noxious diseases. Aquatic vegetation can also reduce the amount of recreational activities that would be going on in your water body, whether it's taking a boat through your water body, whether it's swimming. It can definitely reduce your overall recreation that's going on in your pond. So by managing it, of course, you're enhancing that. And then, of course, it can also improve your fish and wildlife habitat. And I know I said water loss as the number one thing, but actually, as someone who has more of a fisheries background, this would be the number one thing for me. If you have something like you see on the left-hand side there, just completely covering the top of your water body, you're going to have some significant impacts on your fishery. And so if you're having something that's covering the water surface, you're limiting the amount of light that's able to hit some of your beneficial algae which produce oxygen. And we'll talk about that in a little bit with our planktonic algae. But if you have a fishery, this is probably one of the #1 reasons to control your aquatic vegetation. And along with that, of course, it can also improve your wildlife habitat. And so why does it become problematic? Well, other than aquatic vegetation growing in literally a nutrient sink, your pond, which accumulates nutrients over time, they are able to propagate by many different means. And so you have your maybe your traditionally thought propagation through seeds. You have fragments, which is very large, a very big way of aquatic vegetation producing, especially our submerged vegetation, which helps or which impacts the type of management that you would be choosing. And so we'll cover that a little bit later on. Of course, they can reproduce by their root systems and then also their vegetative offshoots. So there's multiple ways, usually for even a single species, they have multiple ways that they can reproduce and propagate. And so this makes aquatic vegetation kind of have an edge from being able to, say, not only reproduce by fragments, but also have seed reproduction. Another reason for why aquatic vegetation becomes problematic is it can actually tolerate flooding and droughts. And so we'll talk about an example with our water primrose, which is a pretty commonly a pretty common type of aquatic vegetation that is found to be a nuisance around ponds, and how it's able to adapt from its land form to its aquatic form. A lot of our species are also able to adapt through drought, and that's why you're going to see today, I'm not going to go into drawdowns or anything, but some of our species, like our pondweeds, even by drawing down the water and having increased time drying out in that sediment, it can actually, the pondweeds can actually bounce back from just the roots that are underlying in the sediment, if that makes sense. So moving on to prevention and just covering prevention kind of quickly to give you somewhat of a background. And so there's a couple of different things that you can do to prevent aquatic vegetation. And so one of the first things when you're constructing or maintaining your pond, you can deepen the edges to about 2.5 to 3 feet. This gives you a nice steep slope going into your pond, and so this will help eliminate the amount of area that aquatic vegetation is able to encroach out into your pond. You can also mess around with your slope and keeping that increased slope going further into your pond. I'm not going to really go over too much of that today, but I can go over it at the end as well. Just keep in mind that you will need to maintain your pond more and more, especially if you have livestock constantly entering and exiting your pond. Of course, they're impacting your pond bank, and they're kind of creating a nice little shallow area around your pond where aquatic vegetation can thrive. I have fertilization up here. A lot of people aren't familiar with pond fertilization, so this is a little different than your terrestrial fertilization. Of course, you're going to actually be using a fertilizer that's high in phosphorus to create a phytoplankton bloom, and we'll talk about phytoplankton a little bit later on. It can be a nuisance, but we view it typically as beneficial when doing it the right way. So fertilization can prevent rooted plants from establishing by shading the pond bottom. And so you'll see this is a very common theme with prevention, especially if maybe you've attended some of my other talks that are specifically on prevention, or did maybe your own research. And so limiting or shading the amount of light that's reaching the pond bottom is going to be one of the #1 ways that you can reduce aquatic vegetation. Another plus of fertilization is it actually creates a strong food chain. And so those planktonic algae or phytoplankton actually provide food for your zooplankton and your larval fishes. And so if you have a fishery, this is definitely beneficial. This helps enhance recruitment, so the amount of fish that are being produced and going to a reproductive stage, so having that constant supply of fish in your pond, it's really beneficial. The last one you see on here is dyes. These also shade like fertilization, but these do not have food chain enhancement. And so there's a lot of pond dyes on the market, many different colors. They, again, shade the pond bottom. They're very effective, especially in terms of some of our algae species as well, but they do not provide food chain enhancement, and they can actually they can shade the pond bottom, or they can shade the water so much that they're actually decreasing the amount of those beneficial algae, those phytoplankton, and so it can actually have an adverse effect on your overall food chain. So typically we do not recommend these for ponds that have a fishery present. These are really good for ponds, especially if you use a pond for recreation or maybe some of your other uses as well. Just again, we're covering a little bit of the background for control. Mechanical control, this is something where, of course, it's always an option, whether or not it's feasible and whether or not the landowner wants to do it. That's another story. And so mechanical control, this requires a lot of cutting. Not only does it require a lot of cutting, but if you think of it like a haircut, it only cuts and does not completely eliminate. So it's going to keep growing back. After you cut it, you're going to have to remove the cut vegetation because you don't want a lot of rotting vegetation in the water column at once. The rotting vegetation in the water column actually requires bacteria to break down those plant cells, and those bacteria, in order to break it down, will be consuming oxygen in the water column. And so this is going to lower your overall dissolved oxygen, which of course can be detrimental to a fishery if it's present. Also, mechanical control is not going to be a very viable option for a lot of these submerged aquatic vegetation species, just because they do reproduce by fragmentation. So this can actually make the problem worse if done incorrectly. I think the best example for this, and I say it time after time, is hydrilla and our coontail species, that they're able to reproduce by any fragment that is about an inch or more. And so if you're constantly going out and if you're raking your pond, you're literally creating hundreds of new plants. And so it's very important that you identify the type of vegetation that's growing. A lot of people just like to call whatever in their pond, whatever's growing in their pond, algae, and that is not the case. And so we'll cover identification a little bit later in the presentation, but just know that this can definitely make it worse. And then on top of that, it's very expensive typically. Just to get any type of equipment out there is a huge expense, and then it can also impact the surrounding environment. So moving on to biological control. So something, if you've attended any of the other aquatic vegetation talks in the past couple of years, usually when we talk about biological control, we briefly mention insects. And the reason why we usually mention insects is because, yes, there's a lot of press out there, there's a lot of documentation on our biological control insects like the giant Salvinia weevil, which you see here in this picture. But they were typically not generally available to the public, even though, you know, they do play an important role in Texas and part of their overall integrated pest management strategy plans. And so, unfortunately, in the past, facilities were only able to produce them if they were permitted as research facilities, and so they had to have some type of research component. So an example of that would be monitoring, you know, the weevil effectiveness, the same thing with their alligator weed flea beetle. And so effective January 27th, 2021, they had a new ruling that Texas Parks and Wildlife had a new ruling that encourages and facilitates increased biological control production. And so what that means is under this new permit, facilities will be allowed to sell biological control organisms, so like our giant Salvinia weevil, with the exotic plants that serve as hosts, so your giant Salvinia. And so this is for the purpose of introducing this biological control agent. And so basically, when they're growing the giant Salvinia weevil, they're growing it on the live, exotic, invasive species, the giant Salvinia, and in order to transport them, they need to transport them on the giant Salvinia weevil's host, which again is that exotic species. And so that's why it's been so heavily regulated in the past. And so this new allowance will allow the general public to hopefully purchase and possess and transport these controlled exotic plants for the purposes of introducing, for instance, the giant Salvinia weevil to manage, you know, your giant Salvinia in your pond. And so this is something very new. Don't expect to, you know, go online right now and be able to obtain giant Salvinia weevils, but just know that this is coming, and this is contingent upon Texas Parks and Wildlife confirming the identification of the plant to be managed. So I'm not sure exactly how this process is going to look. I'm sure that you're going to be able to send in high quality photos and have them identify your species to be managed from that. And then you will be able to obtain host plants from a permitted source. And then of course, stay in compliance with anything else. For example, if you are introducing into public waters along your shoreline for some reason, staying in compliance with the treatment proposal from the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. And so this is something that's very new and very exciting, and hopefully this will help in terms of more integrated pest management strategies for private pond owners. And so I will mention one thing, that even though these insects are very effective at controlling their particular species that they're introduced for, most of the time they really just stop them from growing. They do not completely kill the plant, and so they do have to be combined with usually a herbicide. And so just keep that in mind. These aren't going to necessarily kill the plant, but they will stop the growth. They will stop it from getting worse. Usually these insects are very cold intolerant, so they will begin to die. They will die off in our winter months, especially with what just happened a couple of weeks ago. If that continues to happen year after year. So just be mindful that if this is something you're going to be doing, that you're going to have to stock them annually. So moving on to our herbivorous fish. And so this is the slide, or this is the information that you would typically see prior to 2021, that effective date January 27th. And so triploid grass carp They require a permit from Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. They do require that you have an escapement barrier on your inflow and your outflow pipes to prevent any escapees. Triploid grass carp are typically effective for about 5 to 7 years, but they're not going to be effective the first year you stock them, just due to eating limitations. And so if you're going to stock them this upcoming year, they're usually not going to control what you're going to want them to control. But once vegetation dies off this following winter, they'll be able to keep up with the maintenance of that. And so you'll be wanting to stock triploid grass carp at about 10 to 12 inches. That's the size that you're going to be stocking in the spring. And we'll talk about kind of in terms of stocking densities in a second. But you'll see on here I have listed hydrilla, bushy pondweed, American pondweed, and Illinois pondweed. These are the #1 things that triploid grass carp like to control. Just like humans, triploid grass carp do have a palate, and so they're not going to just control anything in your pond. For the most part, they do like to control a lot of our submerged aquatic plants, but just know that these are their preferred species. And so if you have something in there like coontail, for instance, they might manage it, but for the most part, if they have something else to eat, they're going to eat it. They're not huge fans of our coontail, and we'll talk about why in a second. But we have our Mozambique tilapia here over on the right. Mozambique tilapia, up to this point, and again, I'll explain this in a second, they do not require a permit to be stocked. And so the reason for this is because they're very cold intolerant, and they typically die off when the water temperature is less than 55 degrees Fahrenheit. And so really, if this is the type of vegetation management you want in your pond, you are going to have to stock them yearly, just like I discussed with our biological control insects. And so for Mozambique tilapia, you will stock them once the water temperature has stabilized above 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Typically, we recommend a stocking rate of mixed sex of 25 to 30 pounds per acre. Tilapia are very effective at controlling duckweed and azolla. And I have filamentous algae listed on here. I wouldn't say that they're very effective at controlling filamentous algae. They will control it some, but to the point of what most pond owners are wanting, they're not going to be very effective, and you should introduce them as part of an integrated pest management strategy. And we'll talk about that when I go over filamentous algae. So we come now to January 27th, 2021. And so Texas Parks and Wildlife Department is requiring that prior to stocking tilapia in private ponds, if you're in the conservation zone, you will need a permit. Now for Fort Bend County and surrounding areas, you'll see that you are still in the stocking zone. No approval is required. So really that just stays the same for you, but I just wanted to cover this because I know with these virtual programs, sometimes we have people tuning in from all over. You might have land out in other areas, and basically this is exciting in terms of the aquatic vegetation world. Something has changed in our management, and so these zones were identified based on an assessment that weighed the potential harmful impacts of tilapia escapes against the economic importance of tilapia pond stocking trade in Texas. And so, like I said, this doesn't really affect you too much. If you're in the conservation zone, or if you know someone in the conservation zone, you can obtain a permit by completing a form on Texas Parks and Wildlife Department website. And so another thing in terms of kind of the new updates is that they're not just limiting stocking of Mozambique tilapia now. And so 4 species of tilapia and their hybrids may be stocked in ponds now. So this also includes blue and Nile tilapia, as well as your Mozambique tilapia. And the reason for this is if you've ever tried to determine what species hybrid tilapia are, it can be very difficult. And so they're hoping that this eliminates a lot of the confusion surrounding what species is which. And all of these species, again, are still very cold intolerant and will die when the water temperature is below that 55 degrees Fahrenheit still. So this really is just helping the sellers. I also want to point out that in their new proposed rules from Texas Parks and Wildlife, they're allowing fast tracking in the stocking zone that you see on the right-hand side for permits for 10 or fewer carp. And so that means that you're only going to go through an administrative review rather than a review by a biologist and a pond inspection. And so again, this just fast tracks the process, but you still have to make sure that you are still putting up that escapement barrier, because escapes are still going to be illegal, of course. And so now this is kind of what you know, your updated slide looks like. So it doesn't change much for you, again, in the Fort Bend areas, because you are within that stocking zone. So here is our just a little screen grab of the triploid grass carp permit that you see here. And so this is something where you can find on, or you will need to go onto Texas Parks and Wildlife Department website, and you can click, of course, you can see how very easy this application is. Basically, what they recommend is 5 fish per acre if less than 50% vegetation coverage, or 10 fish per acre if greater than 50% vegetation cover. And I know during one of my other programs, someone had a question because I recommended 15 to 20 grass carp per acre of your pond, so not necessarily vegetative acre. And so, yes, this is what Texas Parks and Wildlife recommends, but they're also stocking large amounts of grass carp in certain areas. And so grass carp stocking rates really vary depending on the type of vegetation you have. And sometimes stocking rates can go from 50 to 100 grass carp per acre. And so it's really advantageous to you when you're filling out this form, you know, and of course you can make the decision, but typically we recommend stocking based on your total acreage versus your vegetation cover, especially if you have multiple species that grass carp is going to control. Moving on to chemical control. Here we have our 15 active ingredients approved for aquatic use. I'm not going to go over each one of these, but it's important to note that even though you know, one of the active ingredients that you see on here may be in a product, it's not necessarily labeled for aquatic use. And so just an example I always give, because people are always pretty familiar about it, but a terrestrial labeled herbicide may contain the active ingredient glyphosate, and this is not, so for example, Roundup. Roundup is a terrestrial herbicide that contains active ingredient glyphosate. That is not labeled for aquatic use. And so it is illegal, because remember, the label is the law, to use it. And so we have instead the kind of sister or cousin of that is rodeo. So rodeo has the active ingredient glyphosate and is labeled for aquatic use. So just keep that in mind when you're using some of these active ingredients that are used very commonly in terrestrial applications. So this includes your 2,4-D, glyphosate, and some of your others as well. So just keep that in mind. We also, if you haven't attended an aquatic vegetation talk in a while, you probably see this last one here on the bottom. And so fluorophylloxyphene benzol, this is one of our newest active ingredients labeled or approved by the EPA for aquatic use. This is something that a lot of research is still coming out about. It's going to take a little bit of time finding out what's effective in terms of management, but just know that right now this isn't really available to private pond owners unless if you're hiring out. And so in order for the company who really sells the only trade name for this right now, the trade name is Procelicor, and so they sell it only to their Sea Pro specialist. And so this isn't something that you're going to be able to go and buy and apply yourself. But hopefully in the next coming years, that will change up a little bit, because this product requires very minimal amounts for very large effects, especially on some of our invasive plants like hydrilla and our water milfoils. So just covering the herbicide classifications before we go into identification. We have our contact herbicides. So these are immediate cell damage at the point of contact. They're very fast acting, but they only cause above ground tissue death. So typically we recommend you using these on your annual species. And so you'll see throughout the rest of the presentation that I have copper and diquat listed a lot, and those are because those are going to be your more common low-cost contact herbicides. For your systemic herbicides, these are translocated throughout the plant. These are slow acting, but they do cause total plant mortality, and so these are used to control your perennial species like your water lilies and your woody species as well. And so you'll see commonly throughout the rest of this presentation, you'll see, of course, all of these effective active ingredients for each of these plants, but I'll point out when you have glyphosate, which is going to be your lower cost systemic, or if you have fluoridone, which is going to be your higher cost systemic as well. And just know that fluoridone is a full body treatment, and so fluoridone, you will be applying it to your full pond or full water body, and it's very effective on multiple species. So I typically don't recommend this in situations where you have beneficial plants growing and you're trying to maintain. So for instance, if you're managing for waterfowl and you're trying to keep some of those native pond weeds as a food source, but you have coontail growing as well. So you wouldn't want to throw fluoridone in there to get rid of, your coontail or your hydrilla if you're still trying to manage for those pondweed species and keep them there. I'm going to cover the differences real quick between the two different types of copper complexes, because I found, while I've been giving presentations with Extension, that most people don't quite know the difference. And so we have our copper sulfate, which is very common. A lot of people have used copper sulfate in terms of algae management. And then we have our copper chelate. And so copper chelate is something that people have usually not heard of. And of course, both of these are used to control all groups of algae. And so both of these contain metallic copper as the active ingredient. And when you think of metallic copper, what does it do? It sinks to the pond bottom within a few hours of application. But chelated copper is combined or chelated with other compounds to keep it suspended and active in the water longer, so for about 4 to 6 hours. Copper sulfate, on the other hand, is only active for about an hour, and that's if it's applied correctly as well. And so, of course, I like to put this because a lot of people ask me questions about whether or not applying copper to their pond is going to kill their fish. Is it toxic? Of course, if you use it at the labeled rate, it's not going to be an issue. I think it's pretty well known that if you overtreat your pond, you're going to see adverse effects. But copper sulfate, relatively speaking, is less toxic than, or sorry, copper chelate is relatively, when you're relatively speaking, is less toxic than your copper sulfate. And so that kind of just adds a extra cushion for you. But again, at the labeled rate, both of these are fine to treat with. Okay, moving on to identification. This is definitely the first critical step when you're selecting an effective control method. There's 4 different classifications. Hopefully you're all somewhat familiar with these, and you'll notice that within each classification, they have certain trends related to, what herbicides are effective, but of course there's always exceptions. And so we have algae, which are our primitive non-seed bearing plants with no roots, stems, or true leaves. We have our floating vegetation. This is where all parts of the plant float, including the roots. We have our submerged vegetation, which are mostly underwater and rooted with limp stems. And then we have our emergent vegetation, which is rooted with stiff or rigid stems with all or parts standing above the water's surface. And so you'll see later on that water lilies are actually included in the emergent classification because while they do have floating leaves, they have very large root systems that are going underneath the sediment. And so moving into algae, algae is kind of special in a way. It's kind of a beast. There's 3 different classifications within this classification. And so we have our planktonic algae, filamentous algae, and macroalgae. And so planktonic algae is microscopic and floating. Filamentous algae, this is more stringy and hair-like, and it has those bubbly looking surface mats like you saw in the title slide. And then macroalgae, this looks like rooted plants but has no roots, stems, or true leaves. And so starting first with our planktonic algae, these are microscopic, single-celled, free-floating algae, and they basically exist wherever the sun penetrates. They're also known as phytoplankton, and they're what gives the water a greenish tint. And so these are the types of algae that are typically considered desirable because, like I mentioned before, this is what you fertilize for. They shade the pond bottom. But also, they provide 80% of the oxygen in the water. And so it's very important to have them present. Unfortunately, you can have too much of a bloom. And so this can cause oxygen depletions, which lead to fish kills. And so you can determine whether or not you have a healthy bloom or an overabundance by just measuring the water clarity. You can do this through using a Secchi disc, and we recommend about 18 to 24 inches of water clarity. So that's when a nice, good bloom is present. So if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see that we have what's called blue-green algae or cyanobacteria. And so cyanobacteria are also included in this group, even though they are a bacteria, because they can exist, and they usually exist in these planktonic algae forms, and they can also exist in filamentous forms as well. So blue-green algae, this picture that you see on the right isn't the typical form that or the typical color that you're going to see in the media. The media typically uses that nice bright blue color, but just know that it can be shades of blue, green, brown, red, purple. It gives the appearance of spilled paint. Sometimes you can just see a nice surface film that almost looks like an oil slick. That's another indicator of blue-green algae. And so these are typically seen during hot and dry conditions, and they're usually mixed with your harmless algae species as well. And so the reason why you've probably seen these in the media is because blue-green algae do produce cyanotoxins. And so these toxins pose a serious threat to not only your fish, but your livestock and your companion animals, of course, dogs. That's what you see primarily in the news, and also humans as well. And I can talk about testing if anybody has questions at the end. I can talk about testing and its feasibility. But just know that when you see this in your pond, don't necessarily panic. Just make sure that you manage it as soon as you can, and you take your livestock, your companion animals, and any humans that would be going in your pond off of the pond until you get it sorted out. And so planktonic algae cannot be easily mechanically or physically controlled unless if you're replacing the pond water. And of course, exchange of water from a well or other source that does not have an algae bloom. It will dilute the water, but it's not a practical option for most of the pond owners, unless if you have a really small pond with close wells nearby. Pond dyes are considered a mean of physical control for planktonic algae, and they can be extremely effective, but they should only be used in situations, like I mentioned previously, when you're not concerned about your fishery, so your recruitment and creating that fundamental food chain. And so there's really no biological control for planktonic algae, and so chemical control is one of your main options, and of course that would be through your chelated copper complexes, like your copper sulfate, your chelated copper complexes or your copper sulfate. Moving on to filamentous algae, so this is probably the number one thing that I get calls about, and I'm sure the agents can agree. And so a lot of people they refer to this as pond scum or pond moss, and this is really what interferes a lot with your recreational activities like your fishing and your swimming. And so filamentous algae, they differ from planktonic algae as they form these long, visible chains, threads, filaments that all intertwine that almost resemble wet cotton or wool. And so this algae actually grows on the pond bottom in shallow areas during the spring, which most people don't know. And so when it's healthy and it's growing, it's this nice dark green color. It's coarse, it's difficult to pull apart. And then as the water begins to heat up, the algae begins to die off. When it begins to die off, it gets all these gases from decomposition trapped in the filaments, and it floats up to the top of the water surface. So these are the mats that people typically see and are concerned about. But these mats, again, are actually dead, dying cells. So you preferably want to treat your pond before you start seeing these mats. So when you start seeing, hopefully, these darker green mats underneath the water surface, this is when you should begin treating. And so for treatment, of course, you're going to see this theme with algae. We have our chelated copper complexes and then our copper sulfate. So copper sulfate, if you continuously use it year after year for your filamentous algae, you could be creating resistant algae strains. And so at least every couple of years or every other year, or maybe every year, it's recommended that you also tank mix your copper with diquat. And so again, the reason for this is copper will kill mostly all of your filamentous algae species, but there's certain species that it will not kill. And so diquat will kill those remaining species in that tank mix. And so again, like I mentioned previously, Mozambique tilapia can be added in as a form of biological control. They will keep up with some of the maintenance for filamentous algae, but don't expect them as a total control option. Moving on to macroalgae, these look similar and are often confused with a lot of our normal rooted pond vegetation. And so these have the appearance of having stems and leaflets, but they are in fact a form of multicellular algae consisting of large algal cells. So there's two major genera commonly found in Texas, and we have our Chara, which is what you see up here on the screen, and then also Nitella. Chara is the more one I commonly see just in requests I get throughout the state. So if you look at Chara, this can usually be commonly confused with not only a lot of our submerged species, but specifically coontail, because it does have these the appearance of these cylindrical whorled branches and branchlets. And so the key differences to tell Chara from coontail are Chara has a lack of roots, a lack of seeds, and then also Chara has a skunk or garlic-like odor. And so sometimes it's also called skunk grass. And so when you crush it up in your hand, it has a very strong odor. And that's one of the main ways you can tell it apart. But again, it's also going to lack roots and seeds. For Chara and even your Nitella, you can physically control it through raking or seining, but of course this is going to be very difficult to keep up with because it can reestablish from spores and fragments. Triploid grass carp are the only effective biological control option for managing macroalgae, and of course you can still go through that permitting process through Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. And for chemical control, just like you saw with our other algae, chelated copper complexes or copper sulfate is very effective. And so you'll see, even though copper was kind of the main theme in this classification, there are some slight differences in terms of management based on the type of algae present. These are just some prevention considerations. And so once you treat algae in your pond, when it dies, it releases all of the nutrients contained in it back into the water. And so there's a couple of different options, including phosphorus binders, sludge reducing products, and water column clarifiers that you can add to your pond either during or after treatment that may reduce the amount or may increase the effectiveness of your herbicide treatment or your management. Moving on to floating vegetation. Aquatic vegetation is classified as floating if all or parts of the plant, including the root, floats. And so a lot of floating aquatic plants can be a nuisance to pond owners because they can very easily clog outflow pipes. They can interfere with recreation. They can outcompete native submerged aquatic vegetation that may have wildlife value, and they can also create oxygen depletions by limiting sunlight into the pond. And so this is by reducing oxygen produced through photosynthesis by those beneficial phytoplankton we talked about. And so floating vegetation, it's very adaptive. Even if you draw down your pond, it moves very easily with the water level, and so it can become a huge nuisance. It also is usually very small. You'll see some of the species that we go over, and so it increases the chance of being spread by wildlife and domestic animals and being reintroduced time and time again into your pond. So here we have duckweed and watermill, and from a distance, these both may be confused with one another because they're both very small, green, and egg-shaped. But they can actually be distinguished very easily by the duckweed being larger, having clustered leaves, and having roots. Watermill is going to be barely visible to the naked eye. It's seed-like and it's rootless. So this is the one exception for plants. It's actually the world's smallest flowering plant, but it does not have any roots. But again, it is a plant. It is not an algae. I typically look for these root nerves that you see in the bottom left-hand corner here because size is pretty relative. Even though they're usually mostly mixed in together, you can see that while duckweed is very small, it could be confused with watermill if you were purely going off of size. And so that's why I like to look for the presence of these root nerves.
Hey, Brittany.
Yes.
I had a question from David. It says, is there a preferred water temperature to apply copper products to prevent filamentous algae?
Okay, that's a good question. And yes, so with a lot of your chemical management options, you're going to have to wait until the water temperature is at least above 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Copper is not going to be very effective in colder water temperatures. You may see some effectiveness, but it's most effective at that threshold when your water temperature is above 65 degrees Fahrenheit. And I will say that's when you're going to see that your plants or your algae, that's when it's actively growing as well. And so that will also increase effectiveness.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
So looking here at our, I have pictures of both duckweed and our watermill here. I don't know why I forgot the other title, but both duckweed and watermill are difficult to manage in a large pond. So they can both, of course, be physically controlled through raking or seining from the surface, but the plant material is so small that it can be very difficult. And so in addition to that is they also produce seeds during the warm growing season, which produce a mass seed bed built up in the sediment at the pond's bottom. And so they remain dormant until the sunlight is able to reach the bottom of the pond. And so that's when the sunlight reaches the bottom of the pond, that's when it triggers them to float up to the top, because then they know that they have room to grow and thrive. So you need to keep that in mind when you're treating duckweed or watermill, that when you use a contact herbicide, it will definitely trigger the growth of these new plants. And so you'll also see on here that dicot is only effective on duckweed, and so it's very important to determine if you have duckweed and watermill or just duckweed, because again, dicot's going to be your lower cost contact herbicide, but it is not effective on watermill. For your contact herbicide, if both are present, flumioxin is very effective on both of these, but again, keep in mind it is a contact herbicide, and so it needs to hit everything that you want it to kill, and these are very small plants, and so there's a high likelihood that you're going to miss some of these, and they're able to reproduce or double themselves within just a couple of days. And so if you do choose a contact herbicide, be expected to follow up with multiple treatments. I also have fluoridone underlined up here, and that again is a full body treatment. It's very expensive, but I do recommend these for ponds that are completely taken over with an infestation of duckweed and watermill, or especially if you have a smaller size pond, so about an acre and a half. Floridone is very manageable and might be more cost effective in the long run when you're thinking about labor and the cost of herbicides for multiple applications. And so Floridone will actually continue to kill your plants for up to a year. It will take a little bit longer. It needs a long contact time of about 45 days, so it's not good in ponds that have a lot of inflow and outflow, but it will have complete control of your duckweed and watermill species in your pond. And so I definitely recommend that in the long run if you can, when possible. You'll see on here that I have tilapia and ducks. And so tilapia do control duckweed. They're very effective at controlling duckweed, but they're not very effective at controlling watermill for some reason. Luckily, usually they're both mixed in with each other, so I think they kind of get tricked in a way. And in terms of ducks, there's a lot of research out there on ducks liking to eat duckweed, but there's really not a feasible way to introduce the amount of ducks per acre that it will take to control duckweed. So last I checked, most recent study gave about 180 ducks per acre to control duckweed, and so that's a lot of ducks. Some people will say that they just have about 30 ducks that come through on their pond and they take care of the duckweed, and that's fine, but that's not necessarily a sustainable type of management. And then of course, if you have a lot of ducks hanging around your pond, you might also have some other issues in terms of nutrient management. So both of these can be used as part of an IPM strategy and to lower your cost or your follow-up applications with your contact herbicides. So it's just something to keep in mind. Azolla, these are mosquito ferns. There's two different species commonly found throughout Texas. These are the smallest ferns in the world, and they do require a microscope to identify between species. And so commonly they're just referred to as either azolla or mosquito fern, regardless of what species it is. They are multi-lobed. They have very small overlapping leaves arranged oppositely around the stem with small hairs, and sometimes have more of a feathery-like appearance. And so azolla, you can see on the left-hand photo, is green during active growth in the warmer months, and during months of stress, it actually turns red to brown in color, which you see on the right-hand side. And so you can see it right here in this picture on the left that it's beginning to turn into its red or brownish color. So for azolla, Mozambique tilapia are very effective in terms of a biological control. They love azolla. It's very high in protein. It's one of their #1 things that they like to eat. In terms of herbicides, Floridone and Diquat are very effective contact herbicides. Diquat, again, is your cheapest option, and it controls azolla very effectively. Studies out of the University of Florida show that with just one application, it's over 93% kill rate. And so you will, again, with contact herbicides, like always, probably have follow-up applications, but that is going to be your lower cost. If you look at effective systemic herbicides, we have your carfentrazone, pinoxylum, and Floridone. If you have a pond that looks like this picture, I recommend Floridone because, again, it's effective for up to a year, and it could be the best option for you in terms of the long run. Now, I will say that Azolla, when it has gotten into its dormant phase and turned this reddish brown color, it is not, it is very hard to treat or get rid of. And so Diquat is not going to be effective when this plant is dormant. Diquat requires that the plant be actively growing. Flumiosin will have some effectiveness on this, but for the most part, you are going to have to hit it when it's that nice green growth, it's growing actively, and it's not in its dormant phase. So keep that in mind. Moving on to submerged plants, again, these are characterized by being mostly underwater and have a limp stem. Usually these are pretty confusing, and so if you look at all of these, you might think that they're the same plant. And a lot of these pictures are very similar to pictures I get if I'm lucky, even though they're a little grainy. But these are all different plants. And so in order to tell your Hydrilla, Elodia, Egeria apart, they all have whorled leaflets around the stem, but you can tell them apart if you break the stem off and count the average number of leaflets per whorl. This may not be something that you're interested in or you really want to do, but if you know it's one of the three of these, they all have the same treatment options. So grass carp likes to eat all three of these. They're excellent in terms of control. And then we have Diquat, which again is going to be your lower cost contact herbicide. And then we have Floridone, which is your higher cost systemic herbicide. Remember, with Hydrilla and similar species, you do not want to be using mechanical control. You're actually going to make the problem significantly worse. And so this is one of the instances where you really need to know what you're trying to manage. Unfortunately, Hydrilla is, out of all three of these species, Hydrilla is your non-native invasive, but it's also the most common. So most of the time you're going to be dealing with Hydrilla and not this these other species that are just exotic or even native. Moving on to coontail, I talked about this a little bit earlier, but this is the most common submerged species that I see. This is also known as hornwort. It has these very hard horn-like projections, and that's the reason why grass carp don't really like to eat coontail. They're only rated as fair in terms of management. Like I mentioned before, if coontail is the primary plant in a pond, they might eat it, but they're not really going to eat it to the point of controlling. And so coontail has these clustered fruits with this almost berry-like appearance. They also have a seed that is a round disc with 3 evenly spaced spines coming off of it, and you can see both of those in this bottom right-hand corner. And they have leaflets that are branched very heavily. So keep that in mind for the next slide. This is also one of the species that you do not want to rake or cut because just like with Hydrilla, it reproduces by fragmentation. Diquat's going to be your lower cost contact herbicide, and flumiosin is going to be your higher cost systemic. Keep in mind that coontail can grow in depths up to 15 feet or more, depending on the amount of light that they're getting, which they only require minimal amounts of light. And so if you're dealing with one of these situations where you have these very thick, dense stands, contact herbicides probably aren't going to be your best way to go. You're going to have to look, you know, at your Floridone options, your systemic options. So here's an up close of coontail and Chara, which is your macroalgae we talked about earlier. And so you can see coontail. Not only does coontail have fruits and seeds, and Chara does not, but coontail is very heavily branched. So if you just look at one of these leaflets, and if you were to compare it to what looks like a leaflet on Chara, they are not branched on Chara. And so keep that in mind. That's one way to tell them apart, especially if the seeds aren't present or the fruits aren't present. Also, sometimes not having roots isn't really a good indicator because coontail can be very loosely attached to the pond bottom, and so that might be a little difficult to tell them apart that way as well. American pondweed. This is a native species that if people are looking for a restoration project, they're trying to increase their food for waterfowl, this is typically what I recommend. They have these thread-like stems with leather-like leaves floating on top of the surface, and so you can see that it would be very easily accessible for a fish to move around. They're not going to be dense stands hanging out in the water column because they have these floating leaves. The seed stalks stick up above the water surface, which produce over 100 seeds each. And so, like I mentioned, this is important to your migratory waterfowl and also some of your smaller mammals. Every once in a while, this will get out of hand and get pretty dense, and I recommend just using a contact herbicide like Diquat to use for spot treatments to open up around your docks or your other areas. But typically, Diquat is very effective on our native species like American pondweed and others in the pondweed family, and these do not get out of control very easily. And so there are some instances where I go out to a pond and it's just covered with American pondweed, but for the most part you'll just see little stands of these, and it takes quite a long time for them to grow to complete coverage. Grass carp are excellent at controlling American pondweed. Like I mentioned, it was one of the things that it prefers the most, and you'll see we're not going to cover any other pondweeds today in the pondweed family, but they're pretty effective at controlling a wide range of them as well. So the best time to treat chemically for your algae, floating, and submerged vegetation is in the spring while the plants are actively growing before there's a large biomass buildup. And so you want to make sure that you're not treating during warm periods of the year like July and August. So once the water temperatures have exceeded above 88 degrees Fahrenheit, this is very dangerous if you have a fishery. As the water temperature increases, the oxygen saturation decreases, and so this decreases what's available to aquatic organisms. And if you use a contact herbicide like Diquat that causes fast-acting death when it's applied to a large, dense population, this will lower the overall dissolved oxygen due to just the large amounts of rotting vegetation in the water column decomposing all at once. And so that's why when I mentioned also with mechanical control, when you're cutting, you don't want to be leaving that rotting vegetation in the water column. And so for a pond that's about 4 to 6 feet in depth and contains submerged vegetation, that could equate to about 8 to 14 tons of vegetation per acre. And so just keep that in mind. If you are treating with a contact herbicide, you should be applying them in sections of no more than 25 to 30% of the pond area at a time, then wait a period of 10 to 14 days before moving on to the next section. And just keep in mind, like I've been mentioning, spot treatments will typically be necessary. Since systemic herbicides are translocated throughout the plant and are usually slower acting compared to herbicides and dying slowly over time, they do not typically need to be applied in small sections like your contact herbicides, but you still need to be careful, especially when you're dealing with water temperatures over 88 degrees Fahrenheit. Moving on to our last classification, which is emergent vegetation. These are plants that are rooted with stiff or rigid stems, with all or parts of the plant standing above the water's surface. And so here we have our alligator weed that is non-native, invasive, and prohibited. Alligator weed reproduces by vegetative offshoots, so it'll actually grow upright, reach a maximum height, and get too top heavy and will fall over. When it falls over, it'll put down a set of roots where each node is. So one plant can turn into 10 plants in about a week, and that's how it's able to take over areas so easily. It has very smooth, thick green to pink stems with long lance-shaped leaves. It has a white to silver clover head looking flower that is only present about 3 to 4 weeks out of the year. And you'll notice that alligator weed looks similar to some of our other emergent plants. So one of the key characteristics to tell it apart is it has an opposite leaf arrangement. If that's something that you're familiar with looking at, the leaf arrangement, but also it has a hollow stem. So if you cut it open, you can see a nice hollow stem, like in top of this picture here. In terms of treatment, imazapyr and triclopyr are going to be your most effective for alligator weed, and these are both systemic herbicides. Moving on to water primrose, this is the most common plant or vegetation behind filamentous algae that I get questions about. And so there's a lot of species found in Texas, but they all relatively look the same. In its landform, it's often confused with alligator weed because it does grow erect with long lance-shaped leaves that almost have that same green to pink stem, but it does have an alternate leaf arrangement, and it's pretty identifiable by its 4-petal yellow flower when it's present. And so most of the time when it's in its landform, what you see on the left-hand side, most people just mow it over, don't even really know it's there, but it can sprawl out into your pond. And these aquatic forms that you see on the right-hand side can form islands or mats. And so their leaves become more thick, waxy, and rounded. The stems become more swollen, large, and filled with a foamy pith. And this allows it to float and create those surface mats. And this is typically the form that people begin to get concerned about. So again, if you think all the way back to the beginning of this presentation, I talked about adaptations for flooding, and this is just one example for water primrose. I have a lot of people that get a lot of rain, and then they'll slowly start seeing what's on the left here, slowly start turning into what's on the right, and it's kind of almost at a morphed form in between the two, and that's what it's doing. It's adapting to your water level. So for water primrose, again, there's many different species, but for the most part, 2,4-D and glyphosate are going to be, glyphosate is going to be your lower cost systemic herbicide, more widely available. It's very effective on water primrose. There is a species of primrose that is glyphosate resistant. So for some reason, if your glyphosate is not working, you may have to switch to 2,4-D, again, depending on if you have that one species. And I think you're very unlucky if you have that one species. You will see mowing and pulling here. Of course, it's going to grow back very quickly with any type of mowing or pulling, and mowing may be very sufficient around the edges of your pond. It's something that you can do over and over again, but pulling, if you're trying to pull out those mats every couple of weeks, it's really going to get hard for you to keep up with it. Moving on to cattails, everyone knows what cattails look like. They have that nice cigar-shaped seed head, and so for cattails, glyphosate is a very effective option. Again, it's your lower cost systemic, but you just want to make sure that when you're treating cattails that you use a surfactant or it's going to roll right off the plant. You're going to take that glyphosate and it's just going to roll right off the plant and you're going to waste it. You also want to make sure that you're not treating within 6 hours of a rain event. And then after you get done treating with glyphosate, when it's safe and when you can, once they turn brown, burn them. And so this will not only take care of the plants that you missed, including the roots, but will also allow you to see new growth as it pops up. Moving on to our lily-like species, so there's multiple species that either get called lilies or are still in the lily family. And so it doesn't really matter on species. They all have these chemical options here. They all have floating leaves with flexible stalks, and they usually have these thick rhizomes that you see in the middle picture here. So these rhizomes can store carbs for 5 to 7 years before needing to sprout a leaf to get energy from the sun. And so you just want to be careful when you're treating with a systemic herbicide that you're not treating at the maximum labeled rate and just burning off the leaves. You want to make sure that that this systemic herbicide has enough time to work its way into the root system to begin killing off these very thick rhizomes. And so if you're using something like a foliar spray, 2,4-D, or glyphosate, again, you just want to make sure that you're not burning that leafy green material and you're giving the systemic herbicide time to work into the root system, which may require follow-up applications. If it's a smaller pond and if these water lily-like species are just taking over, I definitely recommend Floridone. It's something that, again, it's going to treat for up to a year, so it's going to have that time to work into those thick rhizomes, and so keep that in mind. Our last one that we have up here is smartweed. So this is sometimes called water pepper. There's a lot of different species in Texas, smartweed species. They also get confused with others like your alligator weed or your water primrose, just because, again, the shape of their leaves, but they have these nice flowers that are white to pink and in clusters at the end of these little stalks. And so that's one key, but the main key to tell if it's smartweed is this paper-like sheath that you see right here. And so this is called an ochrea. That's probably not something you're ever going to need to remember, so feel free to not store that in your brain. But this paper-like sheath, it can be clear, it can be brown, it can be green, and it's a very telltale sign that this is a type of smartweed. Most of the time, people just want to know what this is, but if you do need to treat it, glyphosate and 2,4-D are very effective. This does have wildlife value for your migratory birds and your small mammals. A lot of people who manage for waterfowl like to keep smartweed up around their pond. So again, it's usually not a huge issue, but there are management options available. So the best time to treat emergent shoreline vegetation is in the fall when the plant is storing food for winter. And you want to use a good quality non-ionic surfactant. And so this increases effectiveness by reducing the surface tension of the water, allowing the herbicide to penetrate the plant easier. And so here's a nice little diagram here to kind of show you the overall surface area, the increase of surface area it can take up with a surfactant. This is very important on some of our aquatic plants, especially our rushes and sedges and our cattails. So here is the Aquaplant website. This is where you can find about over 200 plants now, about 220 plants, their key characteristics, and their corresponding management. And so everything that I went over, every species that I went over today is in this Aqua Plant website. And then of course we have some other things on there as well, like fact sheets, and we're hoping to keep adding to it as it goes along. And then we have this. This is a 3-page document that's also on the Aqua Plant website. I'm trying to get together with Dr. Sink to update it to add the latest active ingredient, our fluoropyroxyfen benzyl, to it, and then also add a couple of other things that I think would be pretty beneficial. But you can see that we have our aquatic vegetation groupings on the left-hand side and our active ingredients on the top, and then we have ratings, and these go from poor all the way up to excellent. And so this is something that I keep with me, especially when I'm doing site visits. Again, it's only 3 pages. It's pretty easy. I'm sure everybody on the call is pretty familiar with this, and also the Aqua Plant website as well. And then that's the end of my presentation. This is my email address. You can contact me, if you have any questions, but I'm going to answer questions here. And you'll see these photos at the bottom. And so if you ever need a aquatic plant ID, whether you're sending it to me or your agent, just make sure that you're placing them against a nice light background and taking some higher quality photos. That really helps us out. So let me.
Okay. Brittany, thank you. If you look in your chat box real quick, what we've done is we've also posted a link to a survey. It's not a survey to this program specifically at this moment. It's called Texas Speaks, and it's a statewide initiative that that Texas AgriLife is putting together to kind of find out from community to community, and it gets even zip code specific on needs and issues that will tell us what we need to address. So if you get some time, click on that and take that survey, and feel free, please forward that to your friends and family as well, if you don't mind. We would really appreciate that. I'll be sending a survey as well to you here shortly about today's program. If you'll take that, it's about 9 questions. It's really fast, and it helps us specifically know what we need to be doing better for you, and things that maybe if we didn't cover something today, maybe there's something that you missed. Let us know, and that's what we're about. Well, enough of me and announcements. Does anyone have any questions? You're more than welcome to unmute and ask Brittany anything that you have. Is there anything out there at all? Or you can type it in too.
I do want to add to your comment, Philip, and
okay.
I like when people give me feedback on more topics that they want to see maybe related to aquatic vegetation. I've been trying to get more specific on especially 1-hour talks. We can really do a deep dive. Okay. I try to keep certain talks more broad, because I feel like if I go really specific, then at the end of a talk, I have someone ask me, well, what about this? Or what about this? Right. But if, there's, a certain need, especially on a county by county basis, I would love to go more specific into the overall aquatic vegetation topic. So yeah, okay. I love feedback.
And with that in mind, if you have something specific that you want to know more about, please write that in, or jot it in the chat box, or put it in, or type in. There's a spot on the survey that I'm going to send you that you can do that. And I have no problem getting with Brittany in us just focusing in on 1 or 2 subjects that might be of great interest to you. You'd be surprised how many other folks probably have the same question but just didn't ask it. So keep that in mind, folks. And I guess. Is there any, I want to open it up. I don't want to leave anybody behind. Does anyone have any other questions that they can think of? Brittany, I think you did a pretty good job.
Thanks. It's funny. Haven't done a virtual presentation in like a week or so, which is abnormal for me. And so starting off felt pretty weird still. So
Yeah.
trying to get used to this, a year later, still getting used to virtual. So
I know it's something that I think we're all trying to do, and I think oftentimes, I know it is with me. Sometimes I'm a little less apt to even ask a question virtual as if I'm in person. I don't know. Maybe there's other folks like that, or maybe they're the opposite, and I'm just a weird one. I don't know. But anyway, folks, we want to say thank you so much for being with us today. Thanks for your time, and don't forget on the 11th, we'll be back with Dr. Todd Sink, and we'll be talking about stocking options and stocking the private pond as well, or strategies for pond stocking of your pond. So that's the 11th. If you've already signed up for that one, great. If not, sign up for that one. You can find that. I believe we had both programs where you could register for both at the same time. So that's coming up on the 11th. And Brittany, I'm going to look to have you back real soon, if that's okay with you, on some other options to do.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, folks. Y'all have a great, blessed day. God bless you. Y'all be safe and take care and enjoy this nice weather that the Lord's given us today to enjoy. And y'all have a great day, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.